The Earth is under siege not from one enemy, but every species, from the smallest insects to the fiercest predators, uniting against humanity. Imagine a world where the creatures we've long ignored, feared, or even wiped out are now working together for one terrifying goal: our destruction. And as these creatures rise, ants, wolves, crows, and even plants or cities fall, our technology crumbles, and humanity faces the ultimate extinction. But here's the twist. It's not just the animals and plants that have united. Nature itself has joined the war. What happens when the very planet we've dominated for centuries decides it's time for us to pay the price? You're about to witness an invasion like no other. Stay with us until the end, because the shocking result will change everything you thought you knew about survival and the future of Earth. Imagine waking up to the unthinkable. What if every living creature on Earth, from the ants crawling in the dirt to the wolves prowling in the wild, suddenly decided to turn against us? What if the forests, the oceans, the skies, everything we've ever taken for granted came alive with intent to destroy humanity? This isn't some far-fetched sci-fi fantasy. This is a world on the brink of chaos, where every species, big and small, from the tiniest insect to the mightiest mammal, has set aside their differences to unite under one banner: survival. Their goal? To reclaim the Earth from humans and wipe out our existence. It sounds insane, but that's exactly the scenario we're about to face. For centuries, humans have ruled the planet. We've conquered land, oceans, and skies. We've transformed ecosystems, altered climates, and pushed countless species to extinction or near extinction. We've come to believe that we are the apex predators, the true rulers of Earth, and that nothing could challenge our dominance. But what if we were wrong? What if, in the deepest corners of the wild, nature has been waiting, watching, and preparing for the day when humanity's arrogance would finally tip the scales? A virus, unknown and terrifying, sweeps across the planet, affecting more than just humans. It doesn't weaken the animals or insects, it enhances them. It gives them intelligence, purpose, and coordination. Species that once fought each other for dominance now work together toward one common goal: destruction. And it's not just the predators or the apex animals that are coming for us, it's the entire ecosystem. Plants, insects, bacteria, fungi, everything that humans have underestimated, dismissed, or outright ignored, is now part of this massive, coordinated rebellion. The boundaries of species lines blur as nature itself turns against the human race. Now, cities that once stood as symbols of human achievement are crumbling. The towering skyscrapers, the carefully engineered highways, the vast farmlands, everything is under siege. Nature is reclaiming its territory, and we are the invaders. From rats infiltrating our homes to birds shutting down our airways, the attacks are everywhere. And we, the so-called rulers, are fighting to hold on to what we've taken for granted. But what's truly terrifying is this. These creatures aren't just attacking at random, they're organized. There's strategy behind their every move. And we're left struggling to understand how a war against nature even began. How did we get to this point? Why have these species united? What's driving them to wage war on humanity? It's not just about survival anymore. It's about a world where humanity no longer holds the power. We are faced with the unsettling truth that Earth, the planet we've so long dominated, is now turning its back on us. We're no longer the apex predators we once thought we were. We are prey, and nature is taking back what we've taken from it. It all began with a single spark-on moment that changed everything. A virus, invisible to the naked eye, began to spread across the globe. At first it seemed like any other outbreak. A few isolated cases here and there, animals suddenly falling ill, showing strange symptoms, but nothing too alarming. Humans barely gave it a second thought. But then, something happened. The virus didn't just kill. It didn't just weaken the creatures it infected. It evolved. It enhanced them. It worked in ways that no virus ever had before. It didn't just affect individual species, it synchronized them. The virus reached out beyond species lines, rewiring the very essence of how animals, insects, and even plants interacted with the world around them. These creatures became more intelligent, more aware, more capable of working together than ever before. At first, it was subtle. Ants, simple, mindless creatures, right? Wrong. They began to communicate with a level of precision and coordination that was almost human. They started to behave differently, organizing in massive, unyielding swarms that moved with an eerie purpose. No longer were they just scavengers. They were a force to be reckoned with. Then came the wolves, pack animals by nature, but with their newfound intelligence they formed alliances with animals they would have once seen as prey. Coyotes, hyenas, even foxes, they all moved together, under one banner, in one single direction: humanity's downfall. But the virus didn't stop there. Birds, those creatures we've always taken for granted, the ones that simply flew overhead and were little more than a nuisance, started to work together as well. Aerial attacks began to form. Crows, ravens, and pigeon-son's individual, disjointed species suddenly flew in unison, attacking human settlements with coordinated precision. They attacked power grids, sabotaged transportation systems, and created chaos on an unimaginable scale. It was like they had learned, evolved, and now they knew exactly how to bring humanity to its knees. But here's the most unsettling part. It wasn't just the animals that had changed. The virus was working its way through the plant kingdom too. Trees, rooted and solitary, began to release seeds and spores with unprecedented speed and force, creating walls of greenery where cities once stood. The plants were growing at alarming rates, creating obstacles that humans could not possibly overcome. The ecosystem had awakened, and it was no longer the passive backdrop to human life, it was an active participant in our destruction. The truly terrifying part, it wasn't an isolated event. This wasn't just some freak occurrence. The virus was uniting species in ways no one could have ever predicted. Animals that would never have worked together, plants that would have never interacted, all began to come together for one common purpose: to take back the Earth from the species that had long ruled over us. And so the spark that ignited this unimaginable war was simple: the evolution of every species working as one for the first time ever against a common enemy, humanity. The first sign that things were spiraling out of control came quietly at first. There were reports of strange animal behavior in rural areas: packs of wolves scavenging around human settlements, wild boars invading farms, and the occasional swarm of aggressive bees disturbing the calm of city parks. But it wasn't until the city of New York, a bustling hub of humanity, was suddenly plunged into darkness that the world realized just how coordinated the attacks had become. It started with the pigeons. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But those seemingly innocent birds began taking down power lines across the city, pecking through vital cables with terrifying precision. A flock of crows followed, diving into utility workers as they tried to restore power, their numbers overwhelming the human crews with a synchronized attack. People were left stranded in a city paralyzed by its own infrastructure, unable to escape or communicate, their sense of control crumbling in an instant. Meanwhile, in the forests surrounding major cities, the animals were organizing in ways that no one had ever imagined. It wasn't just the predators launching attacks, even the smaller, seemingly harmless creatures had joined the war. Ants, once thought of as nothing more than minor annoyances, began working together in massive colonies. They flooded cities, eating away at infrastructure, clogging sewers and sabotaging vital systems. Fire ants, more aggressive than ever, swarmed power stations and communications hubs, leaving them disabled in minutes. It was chaos. But the animals weren't working in isolation. They were coordinated, with no creature left behind. Coyotes were now roaming urban streets, working together to hunt down small groups of survivors. Cougars began picking off isolated individuals in the mountains. In cities along the coast, dolphins and orcas formed alliances with seagulls and pelicans to strike at marine ports, preventing supplies from reaching human-held territories. It was no longer a random series of attacks, it was a full-blown assault. Humanity's first instinct was to retaliate, of course. Military forces were mobilized, advanced weapons were deployed, and counterattacks were launched. But every time humans thought they had a foothold, nature hit back harder. Armed soldiers found themselves under siege by swarms of hornets, their guns rendered useless against the sheer number of insects that swarmed their positions. Tanks became stuck in the mud as huge colonies of ants worked together to disable their engines. Fighter jets that attempted to break through aerial defenses were swarmed by flocks of birds, each one working in unison to overwhelm the aircraft. The response to these initial attacks was slow, sluggish, and utterly ineffective. Cities across the globe were falling one by one, their towering skyscrapers turning into isolated fortresses, only for nature to eventually break them down. Roads, once bustling with traffic, became empty, with only the wild animals roaming freely. Humans who tried to resist found themselves helpless, facing forces they couldn't even understand, let alone defeat. It wasn't just the animals causing the chaos, it was everything. Plants grew at alarming speeds, overtaking roads and buildings in days. Vines grew through concrete, trees sprouted in urban areas, and flowers that once decorated gardens now served as weapons, blocking paths and creating impassable barriers. The earth was reclaiming what was once its own, and humanity was left to watch in horror as the invasion spread like wildfire. The war had only just begun, but one thing was already clear. Earth wasn't just fighting back, it was united against us. It took longer than anyone expected, but it eventually happened. The moment of realization hit humanity with the force of a thunderstrike. The world had become unrecognizable. Cities once filled with bustling crowds were now ghost towns, overrun by the relentless tide of nature's revenge. But what really shook humanity to its core wasn't just the sheer devastation, it was the understanding that this wasn't some random uprising. This was deliberate, coordinated, a strategy. The first few days after the initial onslaught had left most people scrambling, unsure of what was really happening. Was this an unprecedented natural disaster? A strange, coordinated series of attacks by terrorist groups? But as time wore on, the truth started to become undeniable. This wasn't some random event, it was the collective wrath of the entire natural world, a unified force intent on reclaiming what humanity had taken for granted for so long. Animals were now communicating in ways no one could explain. The wolves no longer hunted in packs. They hunted in alliances, crossing paths with bears, foxes, and even smaller creatures that would never have dared to venture near them before. Elephants, massive and seemingly peaceful, were now forming barricades to block human movements, using their strength to tear down anything in their path. Dolphins worked with crows to disrupt human transportation systems, forcing entire fleets of ships to be stranded at sea. Nature had become not just a force of chaos, but a highly organized strategic attack. The more scientists and military leaders tried to understand what was happening, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about survival. This wasn't just about food or territory. The Earth's animals, plants, and even microorganisms had formed an intricate network, all with one purpose: humanity's eradication. It was a global war, not of nation-states or political ideologies, but of species, ecosystems, and environments. And humans? We were the outsiders now. The realization struck hardest in the middle of the night, when a team of military strategists watched a flock of birds fly over a military base in perfect formation. The birds had learned to avoid human radar. They were scouting. They were organized. They knew exactly what they were doing. On the ground, the troops were engaged in battles they couldn't win. A swarm of locusts, once a minor inconvenience, had now become a serious weapon of mass destruction. They attacked crop fields, military bases, and even ammunition depots. With their collective strength, they stripped everything bare, leaving entire regions defenseless. Meanwhile, the plants had found their own way to strike. Vines stretched across highways, blocking off entire cities, creating walls of green that no military could tear down. They weren't just growing, they were moving, adapting, reshaping the world as they saw fit. The tipping point came when humans started to piece together the virus. The way it had evolved and affected each species had transformed the natural world, turning it into a kind of hyper-intelligent network. It wasn't just a simple outbreak, it was a signal from Earth itself telling humanity, "You've gone too far. It's time for change." The truth was painful, but it was undeniable. Earth wasn't just fighting back anymore. It had united, and this was only the beginning. In the midst of chaos, something remarkable began to happen. Humanity, that once arrogant and dominant force, realized it could no longer rely on brute strength and advanced technology alone. The war against nature, once thought to be an issue of survival, quickly became a battle for survival against a force so vast, so interconnected, that it seemed impossible to combat. And yet, as desperation set in, human ingenuity, resourcefulness, and adaptability began to emerge as the most valuable weapons. It was the realization that simply fighting fire with fire by deploying military power and advanced weaponry was futile. Nature was too cunning, too adaptable. The military's most sophisticated weapons were no match for a swarm of locusts capable of stripping entire regions bare in a matter of hours. The tanks that rumbled across the fields were disabled by swarming ants that managed to find their way into engines, short-circuiting the mechanical beasts. Fighter jets designed for aerial superiority were rendered useless as flocks of birds overwhelmed the skies, outmaneuvering military radar with a precision that would have been unthinkable just days ago. It became painfully clear that technology, no matter how advanced, was powerless against an enemy that had learned, adapted, and organized in ways humans could never predict. The first step toward human survival was acceptance. This was not a battle that could be won by force alone. Humans were up against an enemy that had evolved over millions of years to thrive in the most difficult conditions. It was time to shift gears. Humans had to think like nature. The early days of adaptation were chaotic and filled with missteps. Governments, overwhelmed by the scale of the attacks, struggled to maintain order. But small groups of survivors began to experiment with unconventional methods of survival. In rural areas where the military was scarce, civilians started learning from the natural world, finding creative ways to outsmart the animals and plants that were now their enemies. They began to use nature's own systems against it. In the dense forests that had once been retreat areas for humans, survivors learned to use the environment to their advantage. The very trees that had once been weapons of destruction growing uncontrollably, blocking roads and cutting off supplies, became a resource. People began to adapt to their surroundings not as invaders, but as part of the ecosystem itself. They built shelters in trees, learning how to communicate with the flora around them and harness the growing vines to protect themselves. It was a subtle shift. Where once humans had sought to dominate nature, they were now learning how to live with it. Scientists who had initially been dismissive of the connection between humans and nature's defense mechanisms began to see patterns. The virus that had spurred the rise of nature's armies had altered the behavior of animals and plants in a way that mirrored collective intelligence. The interconnectedness of the ecosystem was now painfully clear. Survival, they realized, would require humans to think as part of this vast network, not as separate, superior beings. It was here that a brilliant, albeit unexpected idea began to take root. What if humans could communicate with the very forces they were fighting? Instead of fighting every species to the death, could they form alliances with certain animals? Could the ingenuity of human technology and the wisdom of nature coalesce into something that could win the war? Small research teams began to experiment with ways of communicating with the animal kingdom. It wasn't just about using animals as tools, but understanding their behavior, their needs, and how they fit into this new ecosystem. Surprisingly, it worked. Dogs, known for their loyalty, became guides for military and survivalist groups, sensing danger and alerting humans to oncoming threats. Bees, with their uncanny ability to locate food and resources, were utilized to identify and pollinate crops where food sources were scarce. In places where the earth had been stripped bare by locusts, humans began using the leftover roots of plants to regrow crops faster than the invasive species could destroy them. There were, of course, setbacks. Many of the alliances that were formed were fragile at best, and some species, particularly the more aggressive ones, proved difficult to work with. But humans, ever resilient, found ways to adapt. They began experimenting with controlled burns to restore balance in forests overtaken by invasive species. They used the very animals they once feared, like wolves and coyotes, to patrol the boundaries of human settlements, forming an uneasy but effective partnership. They learned to predict the migratory patterns of birds, using them to track weather patterns and find safe routes across the country. But perhaps the most remarkable change came in the form of plants. Those same plants that had once overrun cities were now being harnessed for survival. Scientists, along with the survivors, learned to use fast-growing vines to create barriers around their camps and cities, protecting them from animal attacks. They discovered ways to use the bioengineering of certain plants to purify water, create natural barriers, and even combat diseases that had begun to spread among human populations. Slowly but surely, humans began to understand that they were no longer masters of the earth, they were part of a much larger system. It was a humbling realization, one that required shedding centuries of arrogance and pride, but it was also a powerful one. With their ingenuity, humans were able to adapt to this new world, not by dominating it, but by cooperating with it. And just like that, the balance of power began to shift again. Humans didn't just survive the invasion, they learned to thrive in a world where nature was no longer just a backdrop, but a living, breathing partner in the struggle for survival. When the first wave of animal and plant uprisings began, humans were certain they could fight their way through. They thought brute force military power, technological superiority, and sheer numbers would be enough to overwhelm this rebellion. But they were wrong. Nature, with its newfound coordination and intelligence, had become an adversary that could not be defeated by traditional means. As the devastation spread, humanity was forced to rethink everything they thought they knew about survival. And in the most unexpected twist of fate, humans began to form alliances that no one could have predicted. The first sign of change came when a small group of survivalists, holed up in a forest in northern Canada, managed to communicate with a pack of wolves. Initially, the idea of humans and wolves working together seemed absurd. Wolves had always been symbols of wild, untamed nature creatures to be feared and avoided. But necessity has a strange way of breaking barriers. The humans, desperate for resources and under constant threat from swarming locusts and aggressive coyotes, began observing the wolves. They noticed that the animals didn't just hunt, they had a method to their movements, an almost military precision in the way they operated. Through trial and error, the survivors learned to mimic the wolves' behavior, offering food in exchange for guidance. Soon the wolves were helping them navigate the dense forest, alerting them to incoming predators and guiding them to safe areas where the human-made defenses were weak. The wolves weren't just guiding them, they were protecting them. Their keen senses and ability to communicate with one another gave the survivors a unique advantage in a world that had become a constant battlefield. As word of this unlikely alliance spread, other survivors began to realize that they too could find ways to work with the natural world. Humans, ever the adaptable species, began experimenting with new ways to communicate with the animals around them. But the alliances didn't stop with wolves. They expanded to species once thought to be either irrelevant or outright enemies to human interests. The most surprising alliance occurred between humans and the very insects they had once battled with: bees, ants, and even spiders. Initially, these creatures were nothing more than pests to humans, often viewed as nuisances or threats to agriculture. But as the war against nature intensified, these tiny creatures revealed themselves to be far more capable than anyone had imagined. The realization came when a small group of biologists, struggling to find a way to protect their crops from invasive species, observed how ants had learned to organize and communicate in ways that were eerily similar to human military units. By studying the ants' methods of communication and teamwork, they discovered that the insects could be trained to work alongside humans. Ants, once considered a threat to food supplies, began to help the survivors by gathering food from the surrounding forests and bringing it back to the human settlements. Their ability to communicate with each other allowed them to form intricate networks that were able to bypass enemy lines, locating supplies humans would never have been able to find on their own. What had once been a problem for humanity and invasions was now a resource, as these creatures had become indispensable allies. Meanwhile, bisons, taken for granted for their pollination abilities, became a vital asset in the survival of humanity. With entire food systems disrupted, humans had struggled to find ways to grow crops in this new world. But bees, with their efficient flight patterns and incredible sense of smell, helped guide survivors to areas where crops could still be grown. They pollinated plants that had been ignored, helping human survivors grow crops in the midst of a widespread ecological collapse. The once dismissed insects were now the unsung heroes, keeping human food sources alive in a world where everything else seemed to be falling apart. But the most unexpected alliance came from plants themselves. Once, humans had been masters of agriculture, controlling what grew and where. But now, with nature out of control, the plants were calling the shots. Some areas were overrun with invasive species that made it impossible for humans to grow anything. But instead of continuing to fight against these plants, humans began to turn to them for help. Scientists discovered that certain types of fast-growing vines could be used as barriers to protect human settlements from predators. The vines could be grown in patterns that allowed them to form natural fences, while simultaneously producing fruit and vegetables that humans could harvest. They also found that some plants had developed resistance to the virus that had been spreading, making them crucial sources of medicine. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was adaptation. The Earth, once thought of as a resource to exploit, had become a partner in survival. What was once an adversarial relationship between humans and the natural world had turned into a complex interdependent system. The lines between the wild and the domestic began to blur. Humans learned to communicate with wolves, ants, and bees, while plants provided the resources that helped sustain them. The survival of humanity, it seemed, no longer depended on defeating nature but on learning to work with it. This new world required a new understanding of the environment, and the old concept of conquer or be conquered was replaced by cooperate or perish. The alliances between humans and nature's once dominant species marked the beginning of a new chapter where humans had to shed their egos and adapt to a world where nature was no longer the passive backdrop to human life. Instead, nature had become an active participant in the story of survival. As the war against nature reached its peak, humanity found itself cornered, caught between a rock and a hard place. The Earth's ecosystems, once the silent backdrop to human civilization, had risen up in full force, determined to reclaim the planet. Animals, insects, plants, and even the elements were working together with a shared, terrifying purpose: the eradication of humanity. But in this final hour, something unexpected happened. After years of battling for survival, humanity began to realize that fighting nature head-on was a losing game. The war had been long and brutal, with each victory fleeting and each defeat more crushing than the last. The military had been unable to break through the coordinated strikes of animals, and the technology they relied on for defense had been sabotaged by nature's forces. The realization dawned on the survivors. The only way to win this war wasn't to defeat nature, but to understand it. In the midst of a chaotic final assault on a human stronghold dome that had been fortified with the best technology and the most advanced weaponry and emergency broadcasts, sent out a different message: we must stop fighting. The message came from a group of scientists and surviving leaders who had worked tirelessly to understand the virus that had united nature's forces. They had made a shocking discovery. The virus wasn't just an outbreak, it was a signal, a warning from the planet itself. The ecosystem had been pushed to the brink of collapse by humanity's exploitation. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a call for balance. The human leaders called for a ceasefire. They sent out emissaries to speak to the animal leaders who had once been their enemies. They appealed to the wolves, the dolphins, the crows, the plants, and the bees, asking for a moment of peace to discuss a future where humans could learn to live in harmony with nature. At first, there was resistance. The animals were cautious, unwilling to trust the species that had nearly destroyed them. But as the days passed, something remarkable began to happen. The human emissaries, with the help of the allies they had formed, wolves, bees, and even certain plants, began to show that they had learned from their mistakes. They weren't offering submission. They were offering cooperation. They understood now that humanity wasn't separate from nature, it was a part of it. The turning point came when a group of human scientists, with the help of their insect and animal allies, found a way to neutralize the virus that had caused the global uprising. It was not a cure in the traditional sense, it was a way to restore balance. By using the virus to enhance the communication between species, humans were able to foster an unprecedented level of cooperation. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of unity. For the first time in history, humans and the forces of nature worked together. The swarms of locusts were turned into a resource, helping to restore the soil that had been depleted by years of human industry. The bees, once essential for pollination, were now part of a vast network to spread biodiversity. Even the plants, which had once overrun cities, were now being cultivated in a way that supported the rebalancing of ecosystems, creating sustainable agricultural practices. The final confrontation wasn't about bloodshed, it was about transformation. In that moment, humanity stopped seeing itself as the master of Earth and began to see itself as part of the greater whole. The Earth wasn't our enemy, it was our partner, and we had finally learned to listen. The result was nothing short of miraculous. The Earth began to heal. The ecosystems, once on the brink of collapse, began to thrive again. Humans, animals, and plants coexisted in a delicate balance. The war was over, but the real work had only just begun, rebuilding, replanting, and most importantly, never forgetting the lessons learned during this cataclysmic battle. The final confrontation was not won by force, it was won by understanding, humility, and a new vision for the future. As we wrap up this story of survival, cooperation, and transformation, one question remains: what happens when we stop seeing ourselves as the masters of Earth and start seeing ourselves as a part of it? The war between humanity and nature has taught us a fundamental truth. We cannot conquer what we depend on for survival. In the end, it wasn't the weapons, the military might, or the technological advancements that saved humanity. It was our ability to listen, to adapt, and to finally acknowledge that we are not separate from the world we live in, we are an integral part of it. Now, Let's think about the world we're creating. As we rebuild, will we continue to make the same mistakes, believing that we can control nature? Or will we learn from the Earth's response to our arrogance and find a way to coexist? But here's the real question I want you to consider. If humanity had to learn the hard way, what does that mean for the future of our planet? Are we doomed to repeat the same mistakes, or can we take a different path, one that doesn't involve destruction but collaboration? Will the next generation be the one to break free from the cycle, or will it take another catastrophic event to awaken us? The ball is in our court now. We have the power to decide what happens next. The choices we make today will shape the future of our world, and they will determine whether we can build a lasting, harmonious relationship with nature or continue to push it to the edge. So, I want you to ask yourself, what role will you play in this new world? Will you be part of the solution or part of the problem? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story left you thinking about the balance between humanity and nature, don't forget to share it with others. We all have a part to play in shaping the future. As the dust settles and the earth begins to heal, we are left with one profound truth. The real battle was never about survival. It was about transformation. Humanity, once so confident in its dominance, has been forced to reimagine its place in the world. The war with nature's rebellion wasn't a battle for the future of the planet. It was a fight for the future of us all. A fight to change how we live, how we interact with the world, and how we define our relationship with the very earth that sustains us. But in that reflection lies both hope and a challenge. We've learned, perhaps too late, that the earth doesn't belong to us alone. We share it with countless other species, each playing an intricate role in the balance of life. In our blind pursuit of progress, we forgot that we were part of this grand system, not its rulers. We took, we used, and we altered, but we never truly understood. And it took the wrath of nature to make us see the bigger picture. So, where do we go from here? The future of humanity rests in our ability to adapt. We cannot continue as we have, taking without giving, consuming without replenishing. The earth has shown us its power, but it has also shown us the way forward. The question isn't whether we can survive, it's whether we can change in time. Will we continue the cycle of destruction, or will we learn to live in harmony with the planet? Will we accept our role as stewards of the earth, or will we push it to the edge once again? In many ways, this story is just beginning. The final confrontation wasn't a conclusion, it was a new beginning. The war may be over, but the work of rebuilding, of rebalancing, has only just begun. We now know that survival is not enough. The true measure of our success will be in how we rebuild the world, how we integrate with nature, and how we ensure that future generations can thrive in a world that is both human and wild. As we look ahead, we have a choice. We can move forward with the arrogance that brought us to the brink of extinction, or we can move forward with humility, wisdom, and a renewed sense of responsibility. The choice is ours. The earth has given us a second chance, but this second chance comes with a heavy price. The cost of our survival is understanding. Understanding that we are not separate from the world around us, but deeply connected to it. Our future depends on the choices we make today, choices that will determine whether we continue to live as conquerors or whether we learn to live as partners in the ecosystem that sustains us. The final thought then is this: will we rise to the challenge of this new world, or will we repeat the mistakes of the past? The answer will define not just the future of humanity, but the future of every living thing on this planet. Let's not forget that we are all in this together, and only by embracing that truth can we hope to build a lasting, sustainable future.